is really fun to run an excavator, though, Jonathan. I would not let this steer you away from renting an excavator for some other project. It's totally worth it.
Just make sure you watch all the YouTube videos first of all the other successful people.
Spend a little time on the fail videos, too. They're worth it.
Learn what to do. Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Podcast, our weekly discussion of building, remodeling, and design topics aimed at anyone who cares deeply about the craft and science and work of working on houses. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Associate Editor Matt Milham and Rob Wadsack, Digital Brand Manager. You can email us your questions at fhbpodcast@taunton.com. You can find previous podcasts and check out the show notes at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. How are you guys doing today?
Doing all right, man. How are you?
Good, thanks. How about you, Rob?
Not bad. How about you?
Good. So we're taping on a different day today. That wouldn't mean much to you folks listening, but ordinarily we record on a Thursday, but today we're recording on Monday. Why is that, Matt?
Because Jeff and I are going to Denver.
That's right, because Jeff and Matt are going to Denver. And what are you going to do in Denver?
We're going to be at something there called Tradecraft. It's an organization. I'm not 100% wound up on what they do, but
I just sprung this on you. Sorry.
Yeah. They from what I understand, do things to kind of like try to support and grow businesses. And we're out there for a Keep Craft Alive event. Basically going to be talking about the skills gap and how businesses can basically sort of align themselves to overcome it or deal with that and, be successful in an environment where they have a hard time finding skilled labor.
Cool. Which is everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the event was great because we did it last week, so.
Yeah. By the time this comes out,
right.
Yeah, this is going to be in the past.
So don't try to go to that.
Yeah. But I think with Keep Craft Alive, we're trying to get to a bunch of events like that throughout the year. So maybe next time we'll know in advance when the next one.
We can actually make a useful announcement.
Right, yeah.
Okay.
Plug it ahead of time.
Yeah, I should have thought of that. Okay. So briefly, for those of you listening out there, I think this is the 143rd episode of the Fine Homebuilding Podcast. Mm-hmm. So in that time, we've given out tons of advice to all different kinds of people. And I suspect some of it's good, some of it is probably not, and some of it is probably somewhere in between. So if you have a horror story or a victory story that you'd like to share with us, we'd be love to talk about it on the air. And you can also send those stories to the FHB podcast at taunton.com. Think of it like the Stump the Chump segment that used to be on National Public Radio's Car Talk.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I love it.
Sounds great.
Are we opening ourselves to ridicule and?
Most likely, but I mean, fail stories are the best stories.
That is true.
And we got to keep ourselves in check here. So hopefully we can.
Hopefully, I'm going to be shocked if we gave out bad advice ever.
Yeah.
No, I won't. Okay. So this is the part of the show where we talk about home projects. And Rob, do you want to go first this time?
You keep asking me about home projects, and usually I have something really big going on around the house. And because I had mentioned last time, I think it was, that I got that new old truck.
Yeah, you got a new truck that's a 66 model year, right?
66 Ford truck, yeah. So I'm trying to avoid working on the house by hiding out in the garage and working on the truck instead.
That's it?
So is that a short bed?
It's a short bed, yeah. A 352 V8 with 4-speed on the floor. And
so is this auto hobby something new of yours?
No, I mean, I had 60s cars back in the 80s and 90s when I was in high school and college, and just figured I would have old cars my whole life, and then bought a house without a garage. So I just haven't had any place to work on them, and I figured, I got to get back to it.
What do you need to do? It looks great.
I know.
Oh, it's 20 feet away. Cars always look better than they do. There's plenty to do. But this weekend I was just putting a new exhaust manifold gasket in and trying to get the thing running right.
The guts. So.
What does the missus say about this little hobby of yours?
I looked at a real rust bucket of a truck with her a few weeks before I got that one, and she's like, "Don't buy that. Spend some more money and get something you don't have to work on." And I was like, well, I definitely married the right person.
So why didn't you buy like a resto mod or something?
No, that was at the top of the budget right there.
Okay. That's a nice truck. I love the Baby Moon hubcaps.
Yeah,
it's good. But back to home projects. I mean, I was doing a little bit this weekend. This is the time of year when I start feeling pressure to get all those little things you can't get done once it's either too cold or too dark outside to get done. And so just getting rid of stuff in the yard, selling a bunch of old Jeep parts I had lying around, and looking for the low-hanging fruit for the energy efficiency upgrades, things I can just kind of do in an afternoon or a weekend project.
Like what?
Storm doors, and I think I might have mentioned to you that I've got this sunroom on the side of my house that the previous owners put on to potentially, help heat the house in the winter. And I'm actually in the process of cutting a hole in the wall, putting a high efficiency bathroom fan in there, and putting a digital programmable thermostat that'll run that in the room, so that when the room gets up to about 90 degrees around the ceiling in that room on a sunny day, even in the winter. And rather than just hoping that heat will filter into the house, I'm actually going to try to circulate it with the thermostatic.
So where's the fan blowing?
So the nice thing about my house is that it's got a back service staircase, which the door is usually closed to when we're trying to keep the heat from moving around too much. But that wall, the sunroom shares a wall with that staircase. And so I'll be able to pump the heat up those stairs and then go down the front stairs and essentially circulate them through the whole house, which has worked really well for the pellet stove in my house. My house is an old house, so it's not an open plan house, but having those two staircases has actually enabled me to pretty well regulate the heat throughout the whole house.
So is there a chance that running the fan would actually consume more energy than the heat you're generating from the solar space?
Well, funny you mentioned that, because I'm getting solar panels installed on the house soon, and as part of that project, I'm hoping to try to get. There's a device called the Web Energy Logger, and it's basically a data hub that you can hook up to any number of sensors throughout your house.
Sounds fascinating.
And you can measure temperature, load on devices, solar production, hot water, and so I'm hoping to splurge for that when the solar panels go on and run a dedicated sensor to that fan and be able to measure outside air temperature, inside air temperature, and try to run the data and see if it makes any difference.
Interesting. Wow. What have you been doing?
Nothing quite as awesome as that. No, I was plastering my new closet.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So I did a lime plaster on the outside, similar to the article Ace Carlton did for us a while ago. And
what was the name of that article so we can remind listeners?
What was it called? A Hybrid Approach to Lime Plaster.
Okay.
And
what was the author's name?
Did the exact same thing. Ace McCarlton.
Okay.
Up in Vermont. And I used essentially the exact same process that he did. And I think it came out okay. The hardest part probably was finding the lime to use in the plaster.
I would have never guessed that.
Apparently, hydrated Mason's lime isn't something that is just hanging around building supply stores anymore. And I think it was like the 4th or 5th place I went to. Finally, they had it.
I think that's something you normally find at a Mason supply yard, because they do use it with old stonework because you need to, or Portland cement-based mortars will destroy soft stone.
Right. Yeah.
And brick.
Mm-hmm. But it just makes a really nice, I would say, easy to work with plaster. I mean, it's like really sticky, really kind of smooth, travels on pretty nice. But
is it hard to mix?
No, it's not any harder to mix than concrete, I wouldn't say. I mean, it's basically just a mixture of sand and lime and water. And do you have to let it slake? Yeah, you should let it sit probably for at least 24 hours. But, I mean, you can probably mix it up. I mean, it's hydrated lime. It's already hydrated. Okay, it obviously will hydrate fully when it's wet. And you'd rather have that happen in the bin rather than on the wall.
but it stays sort of plastic for quite a while. Like I woke up, so I finished probably about 8 o'clock last night, and then woke up this morning, and there were a few things that I wanted to touch up, and it was still relatively soft. I mean, I could knock down high spots still, and that was pretty sweet.
Nice. Now, did you say that's the outside of a new closet wall?
Yeah.
See, last time you had mentioned, oh yeah, we're going to plaster my new closet. I was thinking, seems like an awful lot of work to go into for finishing the inside of a closet, but I didn't realize it's an outside wall.
Yeah, no, the inside is just going to be finished normally. I haven't even touched that yet. It's all just screws.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So what would you say to someone who was going to attempt using lime plaster?
Hopefully you know how to use a trowel first. I mean, because there is some skill in getting this stuff on the wall, and also probably spend at least a few weeks, maybe a couple months ahead of time with one of those little hand squeezer things to build up your forearms, because they will get tired real fast.
I bet. So using a hawk and a trowel?
No, just 2 trowels, two trowel, square or rectangular trowels, and kind of like picking it up and, troweling it on with one hand. You can switch when one arm gets tired, and, in the beginning, you're just kind of slopping stuff up there as quickly as you can. And then, once you get, I don't know, maybe a 3x3 foot section, then you start kind of smoothing it out. But it really, the open time is just enormous. So you can kind of just like get it all on the wall and then kind of move it around where you want it to be.
And we talked about it, but we should mention it for folks who might be interested in doing this. You put mesh tape on the inside corner there?
Just on the outside corner, on the left side there. The inside corner doesn't have anything. That's just going straight up against the painted wall. So we'll see how that lasts.
That's going to be a caulk joint at some point, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. And then underneath that, it's drywall. And then I sort of primed it with a mixture of basically just regular Elmer's glue and sand, the same sand I used in the mix. Just threw a couple handfuls in there.
No kidding.
And rolled it on with a paint roller. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's your tooth.
Yeah. Gave it a little tooth. The stuff, it held, I didn't really have a problem with it dropping off. It never really dropped off the wall. It dropped because, of poor technique a bunch of times.
Plastering's hard.
Yeah.
So have you guys ever seen any old houses that had this sort of wall? Because my understanding is that the original drywall was basically a scratch coat for plaster walls. It was intended to be finished
Veneer
over.
plaster.
Yeah.
Yeah. And parts of the country in Boston, you folks know who you are, and Rhode Island, that's still the norm. We get letters in the magazine all the time about why people were plastering, but that's just what you do there.
Yeah.
And another place to look too is because I think we were talking. I was looking to similar research when I wanted to do some lime putty and whitewash in my basement. Same materials, just a different thickness or consistency, and found it a little bit difficult to find all the materials. And there are a few places online where you can order either the raw ingredients or pre-made batches of lime putty and lime plaster, and it's a lot more popular over in the UK. So you can also find a lot of resources, information.
Yeah,
if you start searching that way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people refer to it as restoration plaster because this is like an old school technique. And actually, when I picked up the lime and the sand at my building supply place, when I finally found it, the guy who's like, at the exit, taking your receipt, making sure that you have what you paid for and nothing else. He was an older gentleman, and he saw the stuff in the back of the truck, and he was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like, "Lime plaster." And he was like, "Oh man, you're going old school." He was like, "You doing horsehair?" And he was really excited about it. I don't think it's a thing that a lot of people see these days, but I like the way it looks. I don't like necessarily the totally flat wall look.
Yep.
It looks nice in some places, but I don't know. The texture is nice.
Cool.
Something I like.
How about you, Patrick? What are you up to?
The patio building continues. We burned through the bluestone we had this weekend, so now the decision is, do we buy more and continue it to where the sod is stripped, or do we put pea stone there, or do we return the sod for that little area that's unpaved? And I don't have any answers to that yet. I'm tired of spending money on this project. I hope my wife isn't listening, but Every pallet of bluestone costs $450, and I think it's $50 or $75 for a cubic yard of stone dust. So the costs are pretty low, but I think the patio is just big enough. It's fine.
Yeah.
I got a little work to do around the fire ring. That's not resolved yet completely, but it's pretty close. Satisfying. I like putting down the big pieces compared to the little ones, I got to say.
Yeah. Are you going to connect that to your barn?
Yeah.
Put a little path in there?
See, that little path
least?
probably is going to get a different paving material just because it would work well visually, I think.
Yeah.
Probably something more square. And since it's such a little area, the additional cost for gauged bluestone, which means it's all the same thickness, would be worth it to me because the variation in thickness is what makes it difficult to lay the natural bluestone.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the toughest ththings about dealing with stone, no matter whether it's indoor stone tiles or patios outside. If you can get the consistently cut stuff, it's
so much easier.
You make a smooth base and you literally just lay it down like
pavers,
bricks. Yeah. But what I do when I'm laying bluestone down is I get the nice solid base, and I try to put down obviously the thickest stones first, because then you're
building up for the thinner ones.
You fill in, you fill in with the stone dust around them, and then I've gotten good at getting sort of the rough depth of the different irregularities on the stone, and I usually, once I've got the solid base down, dump kind of loose stone dust down in the areas where I want to lay it and scratch it around with my hands and kind of twist the stone in place, and it usually works pretty well.
And you can tuck some stone dust under the edges too. If you have a wobbly stone, oftentimes it's a little higher, and you can jam it in there.
Yeah,
and then you can get the level and lift the stone back up, and then fill in the rest of the way.
Yeah, and you're better off getting it nice and filled in the middle and having it teeter and then working it down than the risk in having a hollow spot in the middle. And
you don't want that because it collects water. Yeah.
And then take a mallet or a heavy hammer and pack it in around the edges.
The part I really like is the kind of puzzle building aspect of it, getting the stones to fit together with a minimum amount of waste and cutting. That's kind of fun.
That definitely takes the right personality, though. Some people see.
I'm nerdy that way. Like, my brain works like that pretty well, fitting in stuff.
Yeah.
My wife said that my superpower is spatial relations.
And working a grinder.
The grinder is easy. It does all the work. All right. So.
Get to some questions?
Yeah, I think it's time.
Yeah.
You ready?
Sure.
Do it.
I'll read this one here. One of my friends recently asked me about knob and tube wiring. He doesn't want to mention. He doesn't want us to mention his name. Some people say if it's not a problem, some people say if it's not a problem, don't mess with it, and some people say absolutely change it because it's a fire hazard. So the question is exposed knob and tube wiring a problem? You guys want to weigh in on this?
Exposed as in it's just like out on the surface and you don't have any drywall or anything else over it?
Exactly. So this would either be in your basement or in your attic. You could see it, presumably, and see if it's degrading or there's problems with it.
Well, I'd say, attic is certainly the place you'd be more concerned with than the basement, just because you're talking about a surface that's facing up that stuff could be put on top of it, as opposed to just being above your head, suspended between the joists.
So that's not what I thought you were going to say.
Really?
I thought you were going to say it in the attic because the heat would be damaging to the wire's insulation, which I think is totally true.
Well, what I meant by the attic, though, is that people are more tempted to either put stuff on top of it, especially if they're thinking about insulating.
Oh, I see. Yes.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So no, I think attic's definitely a bigger concern. But in fact, I don't have the number. You probably do, Patrick, because you're more of the code nerd than I am. But basically, the National Electric Code specifies that if there is knob and tube wiring and you are placing any loose fill, blown in, or spray applied insulation, that it needs to be removed. It can't be encased in that for fire hazard reasons.
Yeah, because how it works is the individual conductors in knob and tube wiring can give off heat. And if you bury them insulation that quality is reduced, and the potential for fire goes much higher.
Yeah.
So actually, why don't we back up then? Because we didn't really explain. I mean, I'm sure most people familiar with old houses know what knob and tube is, but
Go ahead.
But basically, the way it works is they would install bare copper wires.
Not bare, insulated, but individual
Yep.
conductors.
Yeah, and they would be suspended from your framing members through ceramic insulators, similar to the type of insulators that you see on
Utility poles.
Utility poles,
But smaller. They're like, the ones I've seen are like ordinarily an inch in diameter and probably 2 inches tall.
Yeah, and the reason why it's called knob and tube is because when it was suspended on the surface, it would be wrapped around a little knob or clamped between two portions of a little knob, and then when it goes through a framing member, it goes through a ceramic pipe or tube. So.
And that insulates the conductor and affords some protection to the wire when they're running it, right?
Yep.
And it's common early 20th century, I think probably into the
Like 1930s.
30s or 40s.
Yeah.
We started seeing BX, which was the next type of electrical cabling in common use around the 40s and 50s.
Yeah. So it's in my house mostly.
Do you have BX in your house?
Yeah, a lot of it. And then at some point, I don't know, I'm guessing it was the previous homeowner added a lot of non-metallic.
Yep.
And, that's spliced in junction boxes and running out to all other kinds of places.
So BX cable is more like modern non-metallic sheath cable in the fact that there are 2 or 3 conductors inside. Instead of a plastic, it has a metal jacket. And in many cases, the oldest stuff relied on the outer jacket as the ground. And that's a very unreliable ground. So it's good that that's gone away. Let's just say that.
Yeah, as the spiral metal casing around the BX cables would start to rust, it basically, just like the problems people typically have in cars. When you get corrosion on the surfaces, you start losing your connection, and then you don't have a safe ground.
And
you have no ground at all with knob and tube.
none.
None at all. And so,
Just the two.
yeah, so basically what it comes down to is that, like you were saying when you started, some people say, yeah, it's okay if it's out of harm's way and it isn't disturbed and the insulation seems intact. But certainly if you have access to the wires in an attic or a basement and you're doing any kind of work around that area, it just seems like it's a good idea, even if it isn't code specified, code required, to just eliminate it. I mean, I'm having a new panel coming into my house, new service panel, and the electrician, he's like, well, we'll at least eliminate all the BX cables from the box itself. And I said, at that point, we might as well just do it through the whole basement.
Yeah, sure. Because it's dangerous, right? It's like house fires are alarmingly common in this country. And the other thing is, someone asked if, well, can you put this wiring under insulation? And the answer we said is no. Other types of wiring are okay, but electricians and the code requires that you at least mark the locations of any junction boxes. And the easiest way to do that is to get a little flag. We're talking about attic insulation right now. Get a little flag on a little stick of wood and mark the locations of those so that they can find them later if need be.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to be having to pull up all your insulation to find your junction boxes.
Yeah. It's worth noting, though, that not every state necessarily has adopted every part of the electrical code. So I think California will let you put certain types of insulation, non-combustible insulation, in contact with knob and tube. But it has to meet, there has to be a whole bunch of other requirements too. But I don't have those all available in front of me. But
I think the bottom line is if it's easy to remove, you probably should, because at this point it's more than 100 years old, and the insulation on wire has come a long way since then. It used to be fabric and rubber based, and if you've ever done any wiring with old wires, you know how easy it is to damage that insulation, and then you have exposed conductors, and that's how fires start.
Yeah, just try to bend that wire a little bit. That thing will probably crack.
Exactly. The insulation breaks right off.
Yep.
So that's, if you can get rid of it, do it. Otherwise, don't insulate, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
All right. That was pretty straightforward.
What next?
this is something near and dear to my heart, having grown up in western Pennsylvania, where it's a very hilly landscape. I have a retaining wall holding up my backyard from a relatively steep slope behind my house. The slope is more gradual on one side. I don't know how old the wall is, but it appears to be pressure-treated 6x6 timbers in steps. It was probably put in after the 46-year-old house was built, judging by the condition of the wood. The top tier has poor drainage and no vertical timbers to buttress the retaining wall. Since I took these photos last winter, a crevasse, right? A crevasse about 2 feet wide opened up in the dirt as the wall has slowly tilted further and further away from the house due to the pressure of the saturated soil. I thought about renting an excavator to dig a trench to replumb the top section of the retaining wall with new timbers. I'd make sure to put dead men in and some drainage system. Is this a job for a DIYer? Are there other options to save our backyard from eroding away like our neighbors? What about a rip-wrap wall or giving up the retaining wall and having a few loads of dirt delivered to create a more gradual slope? I'm curious to hear you unpack this. Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan.
Well, it looks like he sent some pictures, and it looks from the pictures like they did kind of attempt to weave different planes of the wall together to give that sort of dead man effect, but it looks like once they got above a certain height, there's really nothing there holding it into the grade.
We should first start off by saying what dead men are. So those are horizontal timbers that run perpendicular to the face of the wall and go back into the soil. And the idea is that the weight of the soil on top of those dead men helps keep the wall in place, right?
Yeah, it's basically a series of levers that are extending into the soil that are integral into the plane of the wall, so that even if the soil was putting pressure on the wall, it would have to actually lift through the soil to tilt forward.
So that's a time-tested way to keep a retaining wall in position. What is not time-tested are pressure-treated 6x6 timbers, and after a few years, they inevitably looking like this. And part of that is that it's a tough job for wood in contact with soil to not rot away, and the other problem with that is the pressure treatments vary considerably.
Yeah, it's really hard to know from one board to the next whether it's been treated well enough, and I've seen boards from the same batch that show different levels of
retention.
Rot.
Yes, and so the first thing to know about using pressure treated lumber of any type is that there are different retention levels, and they're measured in pounds per cubic foot, and it ranges from, I've seen it as low as 0.25, 0.4 is common, 0.6 is common, but the very best is, I think, 1.2 pounds, and that means that there's just more preservative in the wood than the other types.
Yeah, I mean, to kind of talk that into practical terms, if you pay attention to the little tags on the end of the boards, they will say whether or not it's rated for ground contact or not.
Ground contact and buried is even one of them. Yep. And most of the stuff you find at the lumberyard is not rated for those. It's made to build decks which are not in contact with the soil.
Yeah, and another thing, if you are building something like this with wood, but even if you're building out of any other material, having the proper drainage behind it can do a lot to prevent the pressure from the soil, and also to prevent in this case, the rot that the wood is showing.
Yeah.
So, is this a DIY?
Could be.
Project? Okay, well, you go first, Matt.
Well, I mean, I think it could be. Take out what's there, dig back a little bit. You're going to want to put down some gravel, some filter fabric.
Does it worry you that this site is impossibly steep with a new equipment operator potentially
Not
rolling down the hill?
Not in the least. Just make sure that his wife takes out a good insurance policy, life insurance policy.
Keep the excavator on the uphill side. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing the actual construction of the wall I wouldn't be so concerned about, but the grade above his wall, there's a lot of material that has to move in order for you to get dead men deep enough into that hillside. So maybe maybe have someone else do the initial excavation, and
yeah, because he's gonna back himself into a corner and not be able to get that excavator out.
Yeah.
I would worry too, and like this is not going to be a one day's project. So all of a sudden you have all that soil with no vegetation on it. I mean, you're talking about in a downpour you could have a landslide.
Yeah.
Well, and one more thing to consider is that the code actually talks about if a wall is above a certain height, that it does require engineering of the wall. I think it's
4 feet.
4 feet.
Yeah, and it has sort of like prescriptive guidelines for building a retaining wall up to 4 feet
Using
tall.
timbers like
Using
this.
timbers, yeah. And you need to have dead men. A lot of them.
Yeah,
like
a lot of them.
basically every 8 feet on center.
And every course, or
At every course except for the bottom and top. So you have a full course at the bottom of 6x6s, and then the next course has a dead man every 8 feet. And then the next course has a dead man every 8 feet, but offset 4 feet basically from, and you continue up until you get to the top. And, it also talks about drainage and all that stuff and the size spikes that you have to be putting through, 60D spikes into these things. So, I mean, it's a lot of work.
I would, if I were Jonathan, I would really talk to my local stone supplier and start looking at cast concrete retaining wall blocks. The manufacturers of those products have pretty good engineering guidance. And when you combine them with geotextiles, which are fabric layers that work similarly to the way the dead men do, where you put this layer of filter fabric back and the soil on top of it helps keep the walls. Boy, I would be really tempted to go that way because I wouldn't want to have to do this again in 20 years.
So, he asked about riprap, and, a lot of times when you see a builder build a new house on a really steep site, they'll come in and kind of build a boulder riprap wall. I don't know where that falls into with the code because it's technically not a wall depending on how they lay it. But I found a picture of one near my house, and I remembered it being a lot more rugged, but looks like the homeowners have since filled in a lot of the areas with lawn and some other plants and let some of the weeds take over. But so I guess once everything grows in, it's not a bad looking thing, but I'll tell you, sometimes those can be pretty stark looking.
Yeah,
it
you
looks
see
like
them
a
landscapes.
graveyard.
You see them next to the highway, right? And it's always just a bunch of rocks piled on a slope.
Yeah.
But
The other thing I remember people do this a lot in Vermont, and it might be just because of the availability. They do what's called bouldering, and you actually place boulders up the slope, and that keeps the soil there. And since they weigh tons, it's probably not a DIY pursuit, but you won't have to ever do it again.
Yeah.
sure, but even doing that, we talk about people who have the machinery to do something but don't have the know-how. You have to make sure the stuff is at the right grade so that you're not having pressure, because the boulders aren't going to move if they're in there well, but if they're stacked too steep, then you've got a bigger problem.
Sure, and they have to have soil all around them. It's craft.
Yeah.
Yep.
And he's got a pretty steep slope, it looks like, behind there. And boulders will move and roll.
Yeah, totally. That building lot looks like a subdivision that a number of my friends lived in when I was in high school, and they all had like backyards that were like falling off the property.
Yeah. But looking at that, like where that drain line is, if that's supposedly what's behind that wall, it's in the wrong place. I mean, it needs to be sort of near the bottom course of the timbers.
My guess is that's a downspout leader, but I don't really know.
It probably is.
But yeah, I mean, so going back to, is it a DIY project? I'd say maybe it's a half DIY project. That you gotta have someone who can handle the equipment doing the heavy lifting, and then maybe you can save some money doing the actual construction of the wall yourself.
It is really fun to run an excavator, though, Jonathan. I would not let this steer you away from renting an excavator for some other project. It is totally worth it.
Just make sure you watch all the YouTube videos first of all the other successful
Yeah,
people.
spend a little time on the fail videos, too. They're worth it.
Learn what to do.
Yeah.
All right. So our next question comes from a very special guest. Jeff, you wrote us this question.
I did.
What's going on, Jeff?
Yeah, well, as you may recall, I have had some rot issues with my house, so I rebuilt this exterior wall, and
So what was we should probably tell people what was happening with your wall. You had water coming in the house. Is that how did you?
Well, it was coming behind the house wrap and basically lodging in the sheathing and staying there because it was the basement under the deck, so there was no
Drying.
vapor drive. There's nothing to make it move. So.
And how did you discover this?
I was replacing some trim and I pulled the trim off and there was nothing behind it but house wrap.
Did your heart sink?
Yeah. And then, as I delved deeper into it, basically the whole basement wall was gone. I had 2x6 studs that were down to 1.5 inches.
Oh my God, dude! And you have a deck above this bearing wall too?
Yeah.
Oh man,
it was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I tell you. How'd you support the deck while you rebuilt the wall?
I did a temporary wall, a couple of feet in from the ledger side. Yeah.
Existing exterior wall.
Yeah.
Wow.
But the ledger was in good shape, so that's one thing.
So you could have sold the house and nobody would have known the difference.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying, it's like that's what's scary about some of these problems is that looks fine from the outside, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It was just I had some peeling paint. That's what started it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, so don't go painting anyone. That's what I'm.
Yeah.
You never know what you'll find.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, thinking about that, can we talk about what are some telltale signs if people aren't?
Well, let's answer the guy's question
Yeah.
first.
What's the question? Yeah. Okay.
Where are you going, Rob? So you've done this work.
Yeah, and so I was doing the drywall work in the basement because it's a walkout basement, and so I had piles of drywall dust at the edge of the wall, and I noticed it was damp, and so
had you seen wetness there before ever?
From time to time, but not really. I can't say that I. When we first moved in, there was some flashing problems on the basement window, so I fixed that, and that resolved most of that. But it's just concrete, and you don't really know, and it's just the basement, so there's not much light.
So. They're wet.
They're wet.
Yeah. So I don't know. My question really is if it's coming up through the concrete or under the mud sill. It's about a foot above grade where the mud sill is. So I don't know if it's somehow splashing up and getting behind.
A foot seems like too much to be splashed back to me.
That's kind of what my feeling too. And I did do a little exploratory hole, and it does not look like the concrete was sealed.
Go ahead, Rob. Rob's got this one.
So, we're talking about concrete and wet basements a lot lately, but one thing a lot of people don't know is that concrete, it makes a pretty good sponge. The capillary action that can pull water through concrete there's a lot of
tons
water
of
pressure.
water.
There's a lot of water pressure there. So, I can't remember the distance, but it's something like 100 feet that concrete could pull water up. Like skyscrapers sometimes will have water issues from concrete
wicking
water up from way down on the ground. And so it seems like if your flashing details are all good, that that I'd be thinking that maybe the concrete is where the water is coming from. But I don't know. Of course, like you said, you got to take a closer look and see if there's any water behind. You did you say just covered up all of that stuff on the outside wall? Is there any way of looking back there to make sure it's not coming in through the wall?
No, it's all done, finished, painted.
Yeah.
Here's two things I would do. For one, I would tape a piece of 6 mil or 4 mil plastic to the floor and see if you get water vapor moving up. It'll turn to droplets when it hits the plastic, right? Because it can't get into the air. So if it's moving through the concrete, you'll see it as a fog or drops on the plastic, and that should be taped down, and you'll know immediately how much vapor that slab is transpiring. Is that the right word?
Yeah.
Okay.
Transpirating. I have no idea.
Yeah.
And I
Do
would
the same
I
thing
would,
at the wall.
I would do that and see if it's coming through. You'll know if it's coming through the slab then. And hopefully you have a plastic vapor retarder under your concrete slab, but a lot of contractors don't bother with that. It's more a problem with the concrete contractors don't want to deal with it because it means they have to hang around for another hour or two while the concrete, because it takes longer to set up. Instead of it losing its water to the soil, it's got to dry, cure.
Also, do you have a cat?
I do not have a cat.
Okay, never mind. In lieu of litter box.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So
if it is water vapor, I would tell you that painting the slab would go a long way to slowing the water vapor movement through the slab, because a latex paint is somewhat vapor permeable, so it'll allow the vapor to pass, but it's also going to slow down the majority of it, right? You don't want to put an oil-based product on there because it'll just blister off. It just won't stick. And if it's leaking from the outside under the sill, caulking from the outside would be the best plan. A second most desirable would be on the inside. You know, that's not going to be nearly as effective as on the outside, but it would help, I presume. And I think that if you guys out there listening are building or remodeling and have a connection between a foundation of whatever type and the mud sill, the bottom framing member, there's a company makes what is the name of that company, Matt?
Which
the
one?
product is called Triple Guard Energy Seal Sealer Protecto Wrap.
Protecto Wrap one,
Protecto
yeah.
Wrap. And unlike a conventional seal sealer, which is just like a foamy gasket, this has a couple legs on the exterior that lap onto the sheathing and lap onto the foundation to stop air and water movement through that very hard to seal joint.
Yeah.
You ever seen that?
yeah, it looks a lot like the stuff, the butyl membrane that you would wrap a window opening
Yes,
with.
very much so. And it's attached to a thicker, higher quality sill seal.
Yeah. There's also other, I mean, there's ones that have sort of like a bulb on either side, so that kind of compresses
Yep.
as the sill goes down on it, and that creates a good seal. I think it's a neoprene gasket, that one.
So that company's product is Resource Conservation Technology, and I just think they call it building gaskets, and they come in various widths for whatever the width of your plate might be. And you
Yeah.
can use those other locations too. It's a nice product.
Yeah, but those normal sill seal gasket things, you know, they say they'll take up a gap up to like 1/4 of an inch, and I think that's probably stretching it.
I agree.
And, you know, either that Protecto or the Conservation Technologies, whatever it was called, the one with the bulbs, it just does the job a lot better. You
Yep.
get an actual seal.
Totally.
But you know, just having, you were talking about the liquid applied WRBs. Do you think anybody's using any products like that underneath sill plates? I mean, I know that I was on a job site once where they were actually spraying. They had poured the footings for the foundation wall of a house, and they were spraying some similar foundation waterproofing into the actual a keyway that was poured in the footing that the new wall was going to lock into. And the reasoning there is that any surface that's in contact with the soil could be wicking moisture into the house. So even if you've it will. So, and once you have that moisture in the concrete, it's a lot harder to try to prevent that moisture from getting inside. You know, a lot of interior applied surfaces are only going to mask the problem, and you know, some of them just will fail. And so, just anytime you're putting concrete, masonry, anything in contact with the ground, you need some kind of a water barrier on it. And if you're building on top of a slab and you don't know what the quality of that barrier is on the concrete itself, if it's an older foundation and you're pretty sure that it doesn't have any sort of barrier like that, then you've got to make sure your interior surfaces, your framing is separated from that concrete.
And please don't build or pour slabs without a vapor retarder under, because it is so easy to do before you pour, but it is impossible to fix later.
Yeah.
Why do people do that?
Save $50.
Save $50.
Yeah.
And you know, I was reading one of the basement papers on Building Science Corporation's website one time, and they were talking about how it doesn't matter, you're worried about puncturing that vapor barrier. It doesn't matter that if it's got holes or tears or seams in it, because it's a vapor barrier for moisture traveling into the surface of the concrete, and it's all about surface area. It's not like it's a waterproof seal like a WRB on the outside that's shedding liquid water.
Yeah, the most lamest effort, say you get 85 or 90%. That's 85 or 90% effective, right? You're gonna B plus.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just poke all kinds of fork holes in that thing. It'll still substantially work.
And that's the thing is like the concrete contractors say, well, like we're going to put holes in it anyway, if working with the trowels and walking around on it. Well, it doesn't really matter. That's fine. Just put it there, please.
Yep.
And it should go on top of the insulation layer if you're also putting insulation below the slab. So it should be in contact with the concrete for it to be most effective.
The interesting point on that, I was on greenbuildingadvisor.com recently and saw something about calculating foam for underneath a slab. Mm-hmm. And they pointed to an older article about someone using some of the high density rigid mineral wool insulation under slab, which this was a number of years ago, and at the time it was an experimental process, but now it's actually an approved way of insulating. But it just seems odd to me since it's a porous material.
Like it's just going to fill with water, and then that means insulation's not very effective. It's wet.
So, I guess I should look into it. There must be some testing on this by now because it's been around they've been doing it for 6-10 years. I'm not sure, but I don't know.
My wife and I always say to each other, well, they've been doing that in Europe for decades, right?
Sure.
Oh boy, this is about cedar shingle, something that I absolutely love. So this is like one of my favorite building products too. Why do I like cedar shingles? Because they look fantastic. They end up being 3/4 of an inch thick or thicker in their installed thickness. They're easily repairable. And did I say they look great? Yeah. It's wonderful siding. You don't see it too much outside of the Northeast and Pacific Northwest, but it's just a wonderful siding material.
Yeah, I guess the reasoning there is that the colonial style that's prevalent in this part of the country is based on people who didn't have a whole lot of tools and resources and just used what they had around. And
but they did have tons of trees.
Shingles shingles are easier to make with hand tools than clapboards.
Oh yeah. So in New England, oftentimes the three sides of the house were shingles, and then the front elevation had clapboards because that was more expensive, and that was the equivalent of your brick front today on your tract home, right?
Yeah.
3 sides of vinyl siding and the brick front.
Yeah.
I love that look.
Yeah, it's even better when they don't put windows on the sidewalls.
Oh, man, it's so bad. So, this is who. Did we answer your question, Jeff?
More or less, yeah. Basically,
I was just trying to move along.
Yeah. Yeah. You didn't say I needed to dig down to the footing and
Not
seal
yet.
it out.
Not yet. Next week.
You're going to have to report back.
Yeah. We'll
Tell us the test.
Figure out where the
what your
water's
test,
coming from.
if it's from the slab or from coming outside.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's get on to. We don't know whose question this is.
No, doesn't say.
Okay, well.
Jim. Call him Jim.
Jim is a little confused. He's about to do an installation of Western red cedar shingles as exterior siding. 18-inch double-coursed, blue label, grooved, pre-primed, pre-painted. That's another great thing. If you're going to do shingles, get them pre-stained or pre-painted because painting them is terrible. Every official-looking installation detail source, the wall manual from the Cedar Shake and Shingle Bureau, calls for keyways of 1/8 to 1/4 inch depending on the individual shingle width. So narrower shingles need a smaller gap, wider shingles need a bigger one. I'm trying to reconcile that with the seemingly high percentage of shingle sidewalls that I see around here in the Pacific Northwest, done with the shingles butted tight to one another. I'm generally a follow published practices kind of guy. Why isn't everybody, right? Yeah. But the keyed look is less appealing. I routinely see shingles butted tight with no visible ill effects, and I'm tempted to go for this, but I'm left scratching my head.
Yeah.
I have an idea as to why those appear to be butted together.
Okay.
I think that they probably installed them according to manufacturer recommendations
With a gap.
And they have gotten damp and they've expanded. And
Probably
now
because it
you're in the
rains 3
rainy
months out of the
Pacific
year.
Northwest. Yeah, it rains like 9 months out of the year.
That's right.
And so, I mean, that's really the reason for the gap, is because you want to give a little bit of room for those shingles to basically expand across their width. And if you don't, then you're going to get some weird cupping, or I think they call it like fish mouthing. And
It looks terrible.
It looks terrible. They'll essentially, like pull away from the wall.
And the shingles will crack.
Yeah. And so the Cedar Shake and Shingle Institute, as far as I know, doesn't give different specifications for providing these keyways, whether or not they're pre-finished or not. Like, there's not like if it's pre-finished, then you can get away without that. They basically say do it, and the reasons are aesthetics. Because they will take on moisture. I don't know if they're going to take on as much when they're pre-finished, but
They're gonna.
they're gonna.
Mm-hmm.
And like, this is how you keep that job looking good.
Honestly, and I don't know how you could install them without a gap, because it would just be too fussy, right? If you want to put shingles up, I put them on a little ledger board that I screw to the wall with some little legs going up, so you don't have to put fasteners through the shingles themselves. So you have these little legs on the end of a long board, and you put all the shingles on there, and you arrange them so you don't have any overlapping joints. And then I usually, like, once I have like an inch or two, I just space them evenly, and it's just so much faster.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some people are comfortable doing that sort of thing by eye, and if you're not, you just have a little scrap of shingle or some other material that's about the size of the gap that you're looking for, and you just gap them as you go. And
You don't need to do
that is pretty fussy. Yeah, that is pretty fussy. But some people are just scared to eye things up. But yeah, I guess if you're courageous enough to do an entire house in shingles by yourself, then you probably are going to get to the point where you're not putting the gaps in.
I think I put on 22 squares of shingles on my house in Stowe, which is 4 boxes a square, so 88 boxes of shingles. Got pretty good at it, but and that's my pretty wife. She's doing the decorative front gable that we on the front of the house.
Yeah. Did you gap?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course
See
you
the
did.
gaps?
Of course you did.
Yeah.
I didn't want to do this again. This is a lifetime siding product. Why would you risk getting
Yeah.
creative with the instructions?
Yeah, and there's probably warranty issues there as well.
Totally.
I mean, they're going to say, well, did you install it with a gap? And you're going to say no, and they're going to say, well,
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and then, we don't know how old the houses are that he's looking at as examples in his neighborhood, but there's one, he could be looking at them after they have expanded, or two, he could be looking at them after they've had a couple of coats of paint on them, and you just can't see the gaps as much. I mean, that's
Right.
because a lot of those old Northwest houses are old craftsman bungalows from 100 years ago. And
Yeah. You probably can't see it because of all the moss between the...
yeah.
Do you have to scrape that off when you paint, or do you just leave that in there as filling? So
It's called chinking, Patrick.
right,
Yeah.
right, like you'd have in a log structure. So I wasn't convinced that the Cedar Shake and Shingle Bureau instructions were appropriate for pre-finished shingles. So I went looking for the instructions from pre-finished products. And this is the quality of instruction you often get from manufacturers. I love this. Okay, so number 1, it is best to work from the bottom to the top.
How many people do you think have actually done it the other way around?
Reverse shingling.
Mike Girton's working on that.
Yeah.
Are you listening, Mike? Okay. Calculate the number of courses to be installed by measuring the surface area to be covered and divide it by the desired exposure. So this isn't right either. You're talking about the height you're covering, not the surface area.
Right.
It gets better, right? Adjust the exposure to produce even courses. Okay, that's all right. We're getting to the nitty-gritty here. Leave a keyway space of at least 1/8 inch between shingles. The edges must not touch. So there you go.
That's the one and only clear instruction in the entire thing.
Shingles come in random widths. Joints of successive courses must always be offset by at least 1 1/2 inches. Never allow joints from any 3 consecutive courses to line up. That's because, like, ordinarily, it takes 3 courses to fully cover the underlayment, the water resistant barrier, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the exposures are going to be roughly, 5 inches or so.
Yeah,
And it's about
5 or
6
6 inches. Yep.
Yeah, tall shingle.
Clearances are very important to ensure the performance of the shingle and maintain its warranty. The butt line of the starter course must have a minimum of 6 inches clearance with the ground, so 6 inches above grade, and keep shingles 2 inches above abutting roofs. Mm-hmm. So they start off a little rocky, but the instructions start getting better, I would say.
Yeah. The guy was sobering up as he got toward the end there.
That's right. It is best to work from the bottom to the top.
But you know,
That's my favorite.
so, you know, we're talking about how there are pre-finished or pre-primed shingles, there's unfinished, and then there's also kiln-dried versus not kiln-dried.
Yep.
And you got to wonder, there's got to be a lot of variability in how much any one type of shingle is going to expand. So it's kind of interesting that they have across the board a pretty standard
suggestion. Because some of the shingles are flat sawn, some are vertical grains, you know?
Yeah.
And so vertical grain shingles are not going to move like flat sawn shingles, right? Because the grain is the other way. But yeah, the rule is still the same.
Sure.
Because the adjacent shingles could be anything.
And you also got to, I guess, I mean, if you really get into it, you also got to think about what time of year you're installing them and how humid it is in your region that time of year. Because
yeah, sure.
Obviously, if you're installing them in the winter, it's way more of a concern than if you're in the summer, if you're in a humid climate.
So what I really like are kiln-dried R&R pre-stained shingles. R&R means they're re-squared and rebutted, which means the sides are parallel and perpendicular to the butt. Whereas, like, the least expensive shingles are random, and you have to plane them or cut them to make the side straight. So,
Yeah.
Even with all the work that the R&R shingles do for the installer, as quick as I could get, like at the end of the project, I could put up on a day with no interruptions about a square a day. So it is very slow to install. But
yeah, it helps if you've got a helper, so you kind of stay on task. You know, if you're installing and calling out widths and you've got somebody else who's cutting and priming the edges.
Yeah, whereas I had to drag like 4 boxes of shingles up onto the scaffold, and then you rummage through them to get the right sizes when you're at the end of a course. And, you know, I had a cordless circular saw for trimming them to width and cutting the, angled cuts for gables and stuff like that, and that was invaluable. I would say that's a must-have tool.
You don't just do the razor knife?
No, because, I mean, especially when they're really, if you're cutting a lot off, the shingle is probably 1/4 or 3/8 inches thick. You just can't do it accurately.
Yeah,
and it's
you never
slow.
know if the grain's going to follow or... Yeah.
And you're going to end up cutting your hand, so I would say don't do that. It's a lot easier to cut it with a circular saw.
One more question? Or are we done?
I think we're done. I had this new idea here called topics of discussion. And these are 2 things that jump out at me. One is this. So have you guys ever been somewhere that had a pressure assist toilet?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
No idea.
Yeah, especially if you've got it like in a tough location where you have to do one of those back exiting drains on a toilet.
Wrong.
Am I wrong? Really?
So these are low flow toilets that use a tank within the ceramic tank that is pressurized, and it gives a blast of pressurized water. So it's airtight, and it repressurizes every time you flush the toilet, and the idea is it flushes more efficiently with less water. So you see these a lot in commercial buildings where they're using a lot of water and they want to save it. And you can tell one immediately because they're deafeningly loud. It's like, it sounds like a vortex, right?
Okay. Yeah, they had them at the bathroom at the mall near my house, and I remember when my daughter was little, she was scared to death to go.
They're very loud. I can totally understand her fear. So the company that makes a lot of these, Flushmate, and they also make other stuff related to the toilet business, but there is a consumer Product Safety Council recall on these things because they fail and blow up. And I'm not making this up. They rupture with such velocity that it actually will break the ceramic tank, and people have gotten cut from flying porcelain shrapnel. I know.
Yeah, I actually looked it up after I saw the link on your notes, and it turns out they've been making that same tank from 1996 till 2015. So any one of them that's purchased.
So if you have one of these, there's a good chance it's this. So you're going to want to check that out. And I'd wear a face shield when you're going to the bathroom from now on.
A flak vest.
Yeah.
I'm making light, but this is pretty serious. Like, you don't
Accidental
hear about
bruises.
this.
Yeah, I think they said they had something like 1,700 injury claims based on these things exploding. But I mean, I don't know how that was recent or over the course of those, 15, 20 years.
That tells me that it's a real problem, right?
Yeah.
And apparently the tanks rupture and they let this pressurized water and air out, and it.
Were people like slow coming forward with this? Like, why is it only happening now?
I don't know.
I mean, I guess that's kind of an embarrassing thing if you were on the toilet and it exploded underneath of you. It's like a hard one to explain to your friends or whatever. Like, you don't know
What did you eat?
there.
Oh man! So once again, FlushMate is the 501B pressure assisted flushing system.
And yeah, so it's under recall, and if you go and I don't know if is it sold through? Do you go to the place you purchased it? I can't remember how you do that, but basically they will replace it and I think pay for the installation of the replacement part.
I'm glad you read the thing. I just was so overwhelmed with the thought of a blowing up toilet.
We'll put a link to the press release.
And the other thing that was in the news was a South Carolina townhouse. The floor collapsed during a party. And why are you laughing? It's like,
Because I watched the video this morning.
oh my God. So there's like
send it to you.
100 kids dancing and jumping up and down in unison. And Floor Systems kids are not made to deal with that. So keep that in mind. If you're at one of these parties, go outside.
Yeah.
Especially if Jump Around by House of Pain comes on. Mm-hmm. I was actually at a party in college once, and we knew the people at the apartment downstairs from the party, and I went down there, and the beam across their alcove kitchen had separated from the ceiling by about 2 inches.
Oh
Good
my
gosh.
After that song came on.
So deck collapses are alarmingly frequent, and we hear about them in the news. And people often say the deck was overloaded. But the reality is, if a deck is built correctly, you should be able to put as many people as will physically fit on there. It should be builded to that degree, the strength, right? But what no building code accounts for are people jumping in unison.
Yeah.
You're talking about many factors of impact greater than what this floor is rated to.
Yeah, you're essentially building a human pile driver.
Exactly. And it looked to me like these were floor trusses in this. Did you guys happen to see what floor
I
system?
couldn't tell. No.
It looked like either...
You hear it cracking. Like everybody's jumping up and down.
And they hear cracking.
My favorite line from that, from the story that was on the BBC site about it was something like, "We were waiting for the beat to drop, and they're all jumping up and down." And while they're waiting for the beat to drop, the floor drops out below them.
Man, and it looked like a pretty nasty scene. It looked like dozens of people fell into the floor below.
Yeah.
And
I'm laughing, but a bunch of people got hurt.
Yeah. And they're lucky it wasn't higher, right? It was only like an 8 or 9 foot fall.
Yeah.
Healthy young people would survive that oftentimes, but you could really get hurt. And plus, you're landing on a bunch of debris then.
Yeah.
And it looked like steel reinforced floor trusses, which I would not want to fall on. So, kids, college parties, get out of sync. Get your friends to get out of sync if you can, right?
Yeah. Pays to be.
Right? Have no rhythm.
Yeah. Pasty white guy's dancing ability, you know.
Yeah. If you have no rhythm, you might save the day.
Yeah.
So it's surprising to think that. I mean, you see decks when they fail. A lot of times it's pulling away from the ledger, right? So it's a single member failing, but in a floor, you figure you got all these different layers tied together: the sheathing, the flooring, the drywall below, and it's hard to imagine a hole tearing open in something like that.
I've never seen anything like this in 17 years of following this kind of stuff. Buildings just don't fail that way.
Yeah, but you hear the cracking as it's happening. Like
You
you see
think
the
you'd
people
know.
jumping,
Yeah.
and it's just like you hear crack, 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 and then it all goes out, all goes down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, on that cheery note, I think that's all the time we have. Thank you all for listening. Please remember to like us on Facebook and YouTube. And if you have questions, please send them in. We appreciate your listening.
And you know what? To add to that, if you're, wherever you're listening, if you're listening on a streaming source, iTunes or anything like that, leave a review, because those really help people find us. And we're here to help people out. And the more people that are out there listening, the more people we can hopefully help.
Yeah. Happy building.